The Conversation series, it's a string of webinars at Ahmedabad University. Our university is a research university, and we believe in a different kind of education. We believe that there should be scintillating discussions on topics of relevance. Ideas should come from all over the place, and it should not just remain within the boundaries of the university. So that's why we invite deep thinkers from different walks of life with whom we love to connect and have thought-provoking conversations. And so far, we've had an amazing lineup of thought leaders, academics, and practitioners on this platform. And that brings me to today's speaker, Rukmini S. It is my privilege to introduce her. Rukmini is an independent data journalist based in Chennai. She writes for a wide range of publications, including Mint, India Spend, and The Guardian. She was the first data editor of an Indian newsroom, initially at The Hindu and then at HuffPost India. Her pandemic podcast, The Moving Curve, won an Emergent Ventures India COVID-19 prize in 2020. She won the LICO Awards for Excellence in Media in 2019 for data-driven reporting on changing attitudes to homosexuality. Further, in 2020, she received an honorable mention for the Chameli Devi Jain Awards for an outstanding woman journalist. And she's also the author of the book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, What Data Can and Cannot Tell Us About Modern India. And as I was just telling her a few minutes back, I personally think it's one of the best books that I have read in the recent past. So we are honored to have you here, Rukmini, for today's session, and we welcome you. So in conversation with Rukmini is Professor Mona Mehta. Mona is an associate professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. Her research interests include urban transformations and the remaking of city spaces, youth aspirations and skill development discourses, democracy and its vulnerabilities, and the political thought of M.K. Gandhi. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 2010. She's the co-editor of Gujarat Beyond Gandhi, Identity, Conflict, and Society. Her academic writings have been published in journals such as Economic and Political Weekly, South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies, Contributions to Indian Sociology, Contemporary South Asia, and the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. She's currently working on a book manuscript that examines youth aspirations and urban transformations in post-liberalization India. So welcome, Mona, welcome to the Conversation series. Just before I hand over to you, Mona, I would like to highlight some of the rules that we have. So everyone will be muted for the duration of the conversation, except for our speakers, of course. We will request all of you to put your questions and comments in the chat box. We welcome them. We will take all of these questions. We are going to curate them. And at the end of the conversation, say around 5 p.m., 5:10 p.m., we will request our speakers to address these questions. And lastly, I would request everyone who has joined in to rename your Zoom ID to your real name so that we know who is asking the question. So that's all from my side. So now I hand it over to you, Mona.
Thank you, Momita. Thank you to the organizers of the Conversation series, for inviting me to engage, such an interesting and, thought-provoking, journalist, Rukmini S. It is really my pleasure and honor to be engaging with you in a conversation today on how we might better understand modern India through data. And this is an especially important conversation to be had because we live in an age of information that is marked by unprecedented ability to gather, communicate, and deploy information about all kinds of things. But interestingly, this very fact of the abundance of data has not in and of itself brought us closer to understanding truths or insights about our world. If anything, we find ourselves struggling even more to know the veracity of data and how best to interpret it. Sometimes data becomes a shield behind which the truth is in fact hidden. And I hope that we can talk about these issues and various nuances by drawing on your impressive work as a data journalist, Rukmini. And let me start by asking you a very, very fundamental question about what is data journalism? What do data journalists do as opposed to good old field journalists? And how does your work help us make sense of our complex world? So maybe we can start with that.
Thanks so much for that, Mona, and thank you so much for having me Ahmedabad University. In another time, I would have loved to be on campus in your lovely city, seeing the university and interacting with students. But this is a good second best. It's also a great gathering to speak to people who are engaged in issues around research, policy, development, data. This is a great group of people to be speaking to. Your question is an important one, especially when you ask about how it differs from good old-fashioned data journalism, because it's important both to locate where data journalism fits into the broader journalism landscape and the ways in which it is similar, as well as to highlight the ways in which it's different, and to sort of raise the question about whether these differences do need to exist or whether these are changes that we need to see across the board in journalism. So while we saw the sort of emergence of data journalism, or the sort of quaint term that was used in the US from starting around 20 years ago and still is in some conferences, which was computer assisted journalism. The big conference in the US around data journalism is still referred to with this name. So I suppose that was how it began in the US, where while numbers were used in the past, the ability to handle large data sets came with the use of computers in newsrooms. And I think in Indian journalism, data was something that was typically done by the pink press, by the financial news organizations, and didn't really have much of a role to play in sort of general newspapers, except when it came to elections and budgets. But there was never a sort of realization that this needed to be made more accessible to a broader audience, as well as the fact that independent investigative journalism using data could produce insights as well. We didn't have to depend on the government to put out a PDF and then put out their press release on it. Those sort of that sort of thinking around data came more recently. I think the last 5 years have seen a sort of explosion of data journalism in newsrooms, to the point that every large newsroom and most smaller newsrooms have a data team. We're seeing some of this expand beyond English language newsrooms, which tend to be better funded. I think the only obstacle in the course of non-English newsrooms, it's not a lack of desire to have data in their reporting, it's just a lack of resources and budgets. But we're beginning to see a bit of that in non-English newsrooms as well. And essentially, I suppose data journalism can be is telling stories using data, and it can be either sort of explaining or contextualizing data that has been put out, or using data to enter an ongoing debate or an ongoing moment in public discussion. Or the more ambitious and standout variety tends to be using data in an entirely new and original way to come up with investigative insights. So that's the part that needs the most work, that needs the most resources, that needs teams, that needs technical abilities. So I think that's the part that's more unusual, and that tended to be more a feature of Western newsrooms, and that we're seeing a bit more of now. In most ways, data journalism follows the principles of all of journalism, which is whether these are sort of broad, lofty principles of trying to speak truth to power, and trying to bring out something that someone somewhere is trying to hide, those sort of principles, as well as the more mundane journalistic principles of needing to be newsy. For example, you need to say something new. Just the fact that you have numbers doesn't make it fit into the news cycle. You do need to fit into the parameters of what news is. You need to sort of follow the same principles of cross-checking, verification, using multiple sources, speaking to experts to contextualize, trying to add color and creativity to your storytelling. So those principles all work in largely similar ways. I think one of the things that data in one of the ways in which it tends to stand out from other journalism right now is that sometimes it offers you the opportunity to tell a much broader canvas story than other forms of journalism can offer you. And one of the sort of biggest examples that we're seeing the use of data now is around elections. And I think there has been, and I actually felt this when I started off at the Hindu in 2013, that one of the reasons there was such a such a positive response from readers is because of a certain frustration with a certain style of news reporting, typically around elections, which is a journalist lands or sort of parachutes into a constituency and speaks to 4 people chosen at random, following her own subjective biases, and then uses them as a sort of microcosm or representative of the broader story of that constituency, or sometimes even that state that she is trying to tell. And I think that they had reached that point of a crisis of credibility with the media, and then a frustration with readers and viewers about having to rely on this sort of snapshot journalism to tell bigger stories. And I think that's part of why a desire for more rigorously told stories, which could often be done through data, that's where that desire came from, and that's why we see such positive response among readers as well. So there are ways in which it fits into the broader journalism landscape, and there are ways in which it sets itself apart.
Right. I mean, that's very helpful, and it obviously draws us to the question of, data journalists are now a big part of the Indian newsroom, and they must look for sources of data, right? And so maybe you can also tell us what are the primary sources of data, both state and private, that journalists such as you rely on, and sometimes and I'm drawing now on, your book, which I greatly enjoyed. Sometimes I saw you making a distinction between official data and administrative data as well. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But basically, there are private sources of data and public or state sources of data, and it seems to me that we have an abundance of data. So maybe you can tell us, what kinds of questions and insights this available data. I mean, what are these sources mainly, and then what are the things they can tell us, kind of in a broad sweep.
Right. So when I speak to students, in particular journalism students, when I do the class on sources, I tell them that this is the class in which I'm handing over, the keys to my cupboard to you, because the fact that data remains difficult to access, often opaque, and often very difficult to work with because of formats, makes just simply knowing what sources to go to a huge part of data journalism. And because most journalists operate within the constraints of a daily news reporting cycle, if it's going to take you ages to figure out where to look for the data and whether it's good enough and what you can say and what all those column names mean, as if you're looking at the census data, for example, if you don't have that familiarity with sources, you're not going to make the news cycle, and then you end up relying on government press releases. So, even if a journalist does not want to be a sort of, a stenographer to the government, or a stenographer to a corporate, or a stenographer to a non-profit, whoever's putting out the data, just simple unfamiliarity with sources can turn you into that because of the constraints of the news organizations you work within. So it becomes essential to understand where to go for good data. And because of the sheer size and scale and heterogeneity of the country, a lot of the representative data in India is typically captured by the government. Conducting a sample survey on the size and scale that's required to be truly representative is an expensive proposition, and as a result, not something that a lot of private agencies are able to do. So what you end up then with is small sort of online surveys, which become very skewed towards men, towards richer people, towards urban people, towards upper caste, and upper caste Hindus, and then take away from having a more representative sample. So the large government sources typically tend to be the census, which though meant to be an exhaustive counting of every person in the country, suffers from a huge timeliness problem. And this isn't a sort of new or unusual problem. Many countries conduct decennial censuses. It's not meant to be high frequency data. You can only count everyone once in every 10 years or 13, 14 years, as it might be this time around. So there's the census, then there's the vast statistical architecture of the national sample surveys conducted again by a highly pedigreed data architecture within the government system. And this is a system that was set up, as a when we were coming out of the shadows of colonial rule. It was very much part of the nation building project. It was in a way the sentiment that drove an ISRO, for example. It was this feeling that that this is something that's going to be essential for planning, and this is something we can pull off. So in a sense, we sort of hit it far out of our league in the early 50s with what we did with household surveys. India's household surveys were the envy not just of the developing world at the time, but of developed countries as well. And for a country at the levels of income and development at the time, it was an audacious project and truly nationalistic. It was driven by a truly sort of patriotic and technocratic vision. That architecture persists and its strong foundations remain. However, there has been some amount of hollowing out of it over time, and that's something we could talk about later, but that edifice remains. So the national sample surveys remain an essential feature of how we can understand our country. They deal with a range of questions which sometimes people don't even know about. If I want to know where Indians go on holiday, or if Indians take vacations, what do they take them for? You would think that there's some sort of industry body that you would turn to. But the best source of it, only because it's the most representative, continues to be the National Sample Survey, which gives you insights, for example, about how much travel for medical reasons is an essential part of travel for rural Indians, for example, which is not something that comes up in other data sources. Then there's also the National Family Health Survey, which tells us a lot about not just health, but about demography, fertility, about women's rights within families, about sexual violence, many of these essential features. There are two large sort of reliable private, more than two data sets, I would say. One is the India Human Development Survey, which is was conducted twice, and now hopefully a new round will come out. And the reason it's important is, first of all, it's conducted in an academic institution with the University of Maryland and the National Council for Applied Economic Research. It asks much more questions around decisions and behavior than government surveys typically ask. So things about views on untouchability is something that we can derive from this survey, and that makes it essential. In recent years, there's been, I'd say particularly in the last year or so, an increasing realization of the importance, and then a sort of questioning around the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy Consumer Pyramid Household Survey. Now, the reason it's important is because the CPHS describes itself as the world's largest high frequency panel survey. It covers several thousand households who they go to repeatedly, and especially because high frequency, which means frequent data, is our Achilles heel within the government system. Turning to something like this, where rounds are conducted every 3 months, you're going back to the same families so you can track changes over time, becomes essential. But it's closed and it's private, so that raises questions about about the sort of broader implications of an over-reliance on this data set. But of course, it's essential and an exciting possibility alongside some questions in it. Then I'd say there's some amount of opinion polling that goes on, which I relied on, for example, in the chapter where I looked at attitudes to intergroup relationships, to whether intercaste marriage, untouchability. Those are questions that the government doesn't ask. Those are questions that typically come from opinion polling. And the problem with opinion polling in India, one of the problems is that the vast majority of it is commissioned by the media around elections and essentially turns into a version of what they call the satta market. It's essentially electoral forecasting, and forecasting even is a sort of more sophisticated word than what happens sometimes. And that in itself is not a problem. It perhaps makes money, it makes sense for the media in terms of money, but it just means that we don't understand the citizen's relationship with the state or a voter's relationship with her party in non-election times. So it sort of it hollows out our understanding of democracy more broadly. In recent years, and what should have also become an essential source of data is the sort of data that you're alluding to when you talked about how we're sort of awash in data now in the last couple of years, which would have been data from the big tech companies to which we give so much of our information. Data from Google, Facebook, Twitter to a smaller extent, all of the e-commerce websites could provide essential insights into the working of Indian life. However, this data, I am not really sure how to think about it. Sometimes I think of it as, well, they're private corporations and nobody ever said I'd have a right to it. So here they're demonstrating that I don't have a right to it. But then, that doesn't mean that we should turn down the temperature. Perhaps we should keep pushing for anonymized data to be made available for journalists and researchers, to better understand the workings of modern India. And that's, if there's something that I feel that I wasn't able to get for the book, for example, it would be access to these large data sets from big tech companies, which they simply do not make available systematically beyond something like, Google mobility or search trends, which you can get some information on. But yeah, otherwise it's a very sort of curated stream to very select tech journalists that's occasionally put out.
Well, I will have questions for you on that, not on the content of the data, but perhaps more ethical, political questions about how to think about that data and, all kinds of other problems around it. But, so it's good to know that we have a, fairly impressive architecture of data, that, we sort of produce ourselves for the most part, and most, and it's very rigorous also. But that sort of, brings me now to the title of your book, which is very interesting, which is Whole Truths, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, which seems to suggest that numbers alone don't tell us the whole truth, and you point to at least two sort of primary problems with regards to, when data may not be appropriately used. One is the problem of bad or inadequate data, right? The second is about the issue of suppression and manipulation, right? And the second problem is also deeply connected with the issue of building false narratives around data, right? And here I want to sort of quote you in your introduction where you say, and I quote, "Even with this wealth of data, people build inaccurate narratives around how India works, either without looking at the data or because of bad data." Right? They assume, for instance, that vote banks exist where none do, and these narratives repeated enough times become fact and political fodder, unquote. So I just thought, maybe can you give an example of these two kinds of distinct problems about data? One is a sort of suppression, slash manipulation and narrativizing, and the other is, of course, perhaps easier to understand, which is, the inadequate or false data,
Thanks. And yes, I do, see the problems with Indian data as broken down into a few buckets, and not all of it in the bucket of manipulation and manipulation alone. And I think that's an important point to make, because a lot of people, particularly younger people, I feel there's sometimes a sort of blanket suspicion about all data, to the point that I'm frequently asked, can we trust any data at all? And I feel that that's then a failing of journalism if we're creating that level of suspicion without cause for people to feel that all of it is being fudged. In fact, fudging is very hard, and when it does happen, it's typically there are whistleblowers, and we've known about it, and it's very specific. You need to be able to pinpoint what exactly is the error there, and it's usually typically not manipulation. So to give you a couple of examples, inadequate data is something that happens, that's quite a sort of wide-ranging problem, and it's one of the problems when it comes to health data, for example. So we've typically had poor surveillance of disease, and these are all pre-pandemic issues. They were sort of brought to the fore and perhaps even exacerbated by the pandemic. But we've had a problem of underreporting to the extent of, in the triple and quadruple digits around even something like malaria in the past. And this was not a sort of systematic decision to suppress malaria numbers. It's just that our surveillance was poor. Now, one of the official sources of government data on disease and death comes from India's National Health Profile, which itself admits that it looks at data only from government facilities, while the majority of Indians access health from private facilities. So we know right then how much we're missing, and even within that, there's a lot. So our data on most diseases is wildly inaccurate, which is why then people rely on estimates, even though they are flawed, from other and models. For example, the IHME's modeling, which has plenty of flaws, but that's what we end up relying on. So that's one of the sources of one of the areas of inadequate data, for example. Then there's data that's bad because it's incomplete. To me, crime data comes in that category. Now, there's multiple reasons why crime data is problematic, and I won't get into all of them. Just to give you one example, that until 2013, the National Crime Records Bureau, which is India's official source of statistics on crime, did not make public the fact that India followed what's called a principal offense rule while recording crimes in its official statistics. What this means is that if there has been a crime that has taken place and an FIR related to that crime, if the FIR has multiple IPC sections in it, only the quote-unquote most heinous is recorded in the National Crime Records Bureau. So what this means is that we officially and systematically undercount all but the most heinous crimes. Now, there isn't malice in this. There isn't an active attempt to suppress. The government's argument is that including all IPC sections would artificially inflate the number of crimes, because it would seem like there are so many times more, while these are multiple sections put into one crime. My counter argument would be that it's possible to make this information available with sort of cross tabs so that people can see that these are all multiple IPC sections in one crime. And I don't think that that artificial inflation is a fair argument. But until I found this and wrote about it in 2013, the NCRB didn't make this information available at all. So data without full context and without all of the asterisks that are needed to explain the full truth of it, there's a fair amount of that as well. As I said, I believe that, from my reporting and reading, I have found that suppression and manipulation is rarer than most imagine. And when it does happen, it is a big scandal because it's not common. If we lived truly in a banana republic in which all government statistics were systematically unbelievable, then it would not become a huge scandal when someone in the media found out what was going wrong, if numbers were suppressed or manipulated. I am a big flag bearer for the mainstream media, because I do feel like all of the, most of the biggest stories around what's happened with data, for example, have come out of the mainstream media. One example of suppression and narrative building around it, this isn't yet manipulation, it's suppression and narrative building, came in 2019 and 20 around the National Sample Survey, which, really is in a way the holy cow of Indian statistics. It goes through a huge process, which includes an oversight committee. And once that oversight committee has signed off on an NSS report, uh, it's sort of beyond argument. It goes out, and then you can debate it all you like in the pages of the EPW or in the Indian Express's op-ed pages, but it goes out. So twice in 2019 and 20, NSS reports were held back, even though the oversight committee had signed off on them. And both times we know about this because it was reported in the Business Standard by a reporter named Somesh Jha, who found out about it both times. Once it was around unemployment data, which showed a 45-year high, 45-year high rate of unemployment. That data was that report was held back and then released after the 2019 elections, and the report was released with exactly the numbers that had been put out in the news report. But the most sort of egregious example, again around an NSS report was a similar report which was signed off on by the oversight committee but then held back. This was the 2017-18 household consumption expenditure survey, which tells us all that we know about poverty, about what people spend money on, about food consumption. It's an essential document. And this, then the next step that happened was that it was never released. So the narrative that was built around it, or the sort of spin put out in the media, was that it was missing a lot, it was not capturing enough. But my argument is that these were debates to be had in the EPW. These were not debates to be had before releasing the data, which had followed all of the system. It wasn't some outlier or some sort of rogue report. So it was never put out. We've still not had it. So that was an example of sort of suppression and narrative building around it. And when it comes to manipulation, I think this happens on a on a more different scale than we imagine. It isn't actual sort of rewriting in columns or switching of columns, and because that's simply quite hard to do. These aren't tiny surveys of 40 and 50 people where if you change the responses of 10 people, you change the outcome. To do systematic fudging on a sample survey that's representative across the country, I mean, are you going to pick one village in each block and fudge their numbers? Or, you'd have to, the amount of work it would take to fudge a large representative household survey is probably more work, more effort than is really worth it. So I think even around COVID, and maybe that's something we could talk about later, I don't think, we do know that the official count is a severe undercount, but it has both legacy issues as well as sort of technical issues, which aren't manipulation. It isn't a sort of active decision to recode deaths as being not from COVID or not counting them. That's not how it happens, although that sort of looms large in the popular imagination.
Right. And we'll maybe come, I'm sure people are going to ask questions about this in the Q&A, and, I want to come back to this in a different context, maybe a little bit later. But for now, I think we can stay with this sort of line about, it's not so much fudging numbers. That's always the sort of, the devil here, but it's also about popular perception and, and how we sort of go with certain kinds of popular perception. So for instance, you point out, and this is something of interest to me because of my own research on urban transformations, is that, contrary to the popular belief that India's rapid urbanization is sort of, happening, our urbanization rate has actually been far lower, than was anticipated, or that was projected. And the median Indian still lives in the villages, and then migration is not the primary cause of urbanization, right? And so I guess my question is, what are the most fascinating aspects of the urbanization process that, when you look at the data, that strikes you? I mean, for instance, is the highest urbanization taking place in our biggest metros, or is actually taking place somewhere else? And this would have very serious implications for policies. I mean, we're funding urban renewal missions to make smart cities based on certain assumptions about how urbanization is happening. And lo and behold, urbanization actually is happening in a very different way. So I just wanted your thoughts on, how, what is the sort of interesting aspects of our urbanization?
So I think, because I've been a journalist for a while, and many of these are sort of issues that I've been writing about, and then try to put together in a structured and a new fashion for the book. Some of these are things that, in the writing of the book did not surprise me. But urbanization and migration in particular are things that I have not looked at that much in the past. And in the research and writing of it, I would say these are the two areas that surprised me myself the most in the writing of it. I did have, did remember reading research that around the question of the rates of urbanization, and the fact that the real question in the broader global academic community is not why India or how India is how India is urbanizing so fast, but the real question is why India is urbanizing so slowly. And that's not something that ever gets reflected in the popular media. You never see a narrative that's anything except rural to urban migration is flooding Indian cities. That's absolutely the sort of defining character of how urbanization is reported in the popular media. And in looking at the migration component of that as well, that came as a surprise to me. The numbers are particularly small. I would have imagined, you don't imagine the numbers of people living, the proportion of people who live outside where the place they were born to be in the single digits. And that's not the picture of India I had at all. Another feature that I think doesn't get talked about enough, although there is lots of research on it, and people like Chinmay Tumbe, talk about it and write about it a lot, is the issue of female migration, and the fact that median Indian migrant is a woman because of the village exogenous nature of Indian marriage, which is you marry within your caste, but you marry outside your village. And again, it's reflected so little in the popular media, even, all of you, or pop culture, even the image of a migrant is of a man moving to another part of the country to look for a job, while marriage migration is really the largest component of Indian migration. I think one of the smaller parts of urbanization that both surprised me and that I found interesting in a way that only a combination of data and field reporting would ever tell you is all the contestation around definitions. Because for a town or for a village to be reclassified as a town or a city is really an area of such deep contestation.
Right.
And the amount that it can be resisted means that it throws numbers for a toss sometimes. So I had this part in the book, for example, that in the
You talk about the census towns, right?
right.
Yeah.
Conversation around definitions over here. In the 1990s, the temple town of Shirdi near Pune was expanding rapidly. In 1995, the Shirdi village panchayat was converted into a municipal council, and elections to the council were announced. In protest, residents boycotted the elections, and not a single nomination was received. The state made 4 more attempts to hold elections so as to constitute a council, but on every occasion the election could not be held. Finally, the state government had to first reconvert the council to a village panchayat and immediately thereafter to a nagar panchayat, one step up from a village panchayat but down from a municipal council. So if you looked at numbers for Maharashtra's urbanization at the time, and how many town and village panchayats there were, it would make no sense, because all of this contestation around it, a lot of which is around taxation, because tax changes significantly when the definition changes. These are things that numbers alone would not give you a good sense of. So, this isn't the sort of defining feature of Indian urbanization, but it definitely struck me as one of those things that falls between the lines of a spreadsheet, for example, which, the numbers alone would never tell you this story.
Right, right. I mean, and again, I mean, I want to talk about another kind of popular perception, which which you debunk in, Why India Votes and all your other reporting on, on voting. which is this assumption that Indians vote as on the basis of a vote bank based on caste and religious identity. And you debunk that for good reason, and you tell us why. But we also know that caste does persist in rural and urban India. And so then how should we make sense of and understand the fact that the persistence of caste is a fact? And at the same time, Indians are not necessarily driven by caste alone as vote banks, as chunks of people who just, one caste block voting en masse. So how do you, I mean, as a data journalist, how would you sort of help us, nuance that part of the, the puzzle, so to speak?
Actually, I think the problem in the last few years has been an attempt in the opposite direction, which is an attempt to make it seem as if we are a post-caste society, including an electorate, and the sort of argument that Indian elections are being fought on development and on jobs, and that caste doesn't matter. Well, some of this comes from a very literal reading of opinion polls, in which voters are typically asked, what are the top issues that they're voting on. And in election after election, voters will always say jobs and the economy and development are the top issues that they're voting on. Simultaneously, 45% of voters say, for example, that they want their MP to be of the same caste as them. So I think relying on these single point answers leads to a significant misreading of what people are truly voting for. I also think I think the problem around definitions of vote banks is particularly problematic when it comes to the Muslim community. You only see the term vote bank typically used with the Muslim community. And I think what's happening over there is the fact that, we're not going by numbers alone, and we're allowing bias to play a big role in how narratives are being built. So if the definition of a vote bank is a group of people who vote purely on the basis of caste or religion, research by the political scientist Rahul Verma in UP, for example, has shown that in opinion polls, Muslims give the same answers to the issues that they consider most important as Hindu respondents do. So from where then does this characterization of a vote bank come in? If you're looking at a group or a community that systematically is aligned with one party only, then the closest you'd come to the definition of a vote bank would be upper caste Hindus being the BJP's vote bank, because they are the most reliable allies. So these are clearly not numerical formulations. They come from, vote bank is never used in a positive context. It's always a sneer. So if we're thinking about who we're sneering at, or who the media is sneering at when this term is being used, it's loaded, and it's clearly not purely data driven. So I do think that voter motivations are complex, and both news reporting and opinion polling flatten them to a cartoonish extent. And part of the reason is both the media and opinion polls care about voters only at the time of elections. Through the rest of the 5 years, we have no sort of sense of the relationship between a citizen and the state, or a voter and a party. And these are actually deep and moving relationships. When you speak to a person committed to a particular party, someone who truly sort of believes in the ideology of that party, whether it is your ideology or not, hearing a fully formed, coherent explanation of what draws them to a party can be very moving, because as I've felt for a long time, I think Indians vote for ideas, and the ideas part of it is something that we've allowed to exit from the discourse and replaced it with other terms that don't grant the agency that voters deserve to have. There are obviously multiple parts to a person, and all of which might matter at the time of an election. And what lever gets pressed, and then what drives that vote, is obviously complex and may often happen only days before an election even. So I think a better and more systematic understanding of voters over a longer duration, rather than treating them as individuals about to press their finger on the ballot box only, would give us a much better sense of the the matrix of decisions that goes on in a voter's mind.
So let me actually turn to another interesting set of issues about, the realization and what data tells us about the fact that actually India is a fairly conservative, if not fundamentalist sort of, we as a people, we are very much about marrying people belonging to the same religion and caste background and all of that. And so the first thing is, how do you get this kind of data? Where does one, how do you sort of, how do you identify these trends accurately? And my second question is related to this, is how do you also, knowing this, at the back of your mind, how do you also then try to not let it come in the way of certain other things that are also true, but may not be because of perhaps India's conservative nature, such as the women's, decreasing labor force participation, right? This is a real puzzle. As women get more educated, they are actually dropping out of the labor force at an alarming, proportion. And so, there's this India that data is telling us, which is conservative. Even young people sort of have similar views, to their parents and grandparents. So how far would we do with this data? How do we make sure that it doesn't also cloud us from thinking about other complex social issues that may actually not have the same, answer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, questions around behaviors and attitudes tend to come from the comparatively weakest sources of data, because these suffer from a huge additional range of problems, including social acceptability bias, which sort of leads you to give answers that you feel the surveyor might want to, or the fear of being honest. Even, these are difficult conversations to have. Conversations around what religion you're okay with having a neighbor belong to are difficult to have in a broader community. Does your husband beat you or not? These are difficult things to tell a surveyor. So I understand people feeling that that it's likely that that the surveys get a lot wrong. The thing is, though, and the reason that I have this chapter in my book is that I don't think that people have joined the dots on the fact that survey after survey, year after year, decade after decade is showing the same things. If it was one sort of outlier survey conducted by someone, some fly-by-night operator, saying that Indians have these conservative views, then we would have good reason to be more suspicious about the data. However, a range of surveys, both Indian and foreign, by respected organizations, some of them conducted repeatedly over the same, on the same group over time, show these same answers. And that's the point at which you start to say, hey, well, maybe I should take these at face value. And I think one of the reasons that some people find it hard to take these answers at face value is because we have convinced ourselves that we are a tolerant country with an intolerant fringe, and being shown numbers that say that the mainstream is intolerant and the fringe is probably not, is discomforting and is uncomfortable for people to deal with, even though your newspaper headlines are pointing in exactly that direction every day. So I feel comfortable with the data because it's triangulated from multiple sources. And I also feel that if it is bringing a sort of reality check into to many people, then that's good, because this is what the data is showing us, and this is what the world outside our windows looks like as well. Maybe it's time to square it and sort of admit where we stand. But I completely take on board your point that these are not sort of final answers, or do not fully characterize any individual. Just to give you an example, in the book, I talk about a point where when I was in Madhya Pradesh, reporting around wheat actually at the time, and this also brings me to the point that so many of these insights in the book have come by the way. I didn't set out to report on views on caste, for example. In this example, I was reporting on except on a bumper wheat crop. And this is something that sort of came in, never made it to my news reporting, stayed in my mind, and now is in the book. And I talk about going to the house of an Adivasi farmer who had lost his own father, but showed me exceptional, hospitality, which is something that I always experience on the road. And accompanying me was another journalist, a local journalist who I had given a ride because he was reporting on the story as well. And he refused to drink tea, in this man's house, and later told me it was because he was Brahmin and he felt that he could not drink tea from from an Adivasi farmer's house. But later, after that, he took me to his own house because he wanted his daughter to see a working woman away from her family, away from her city, fearlessly sort of reporting late into the evening on the road. In no way do I condone his beliefs. In fact, he and I argued a lot about it. But I don't think, so should we call him conservative full stop and assume that those are his views on everything and sort of not bother to understand him any further? Or should I look at his views on caste and simultaneously look at what he wanted for his daughter and think of him as a complex and flawed person, as we all are, So it's not just that that's a more decent way of interacting with other people. It's also just more interesting because there's so much of people you miss if you want to slot them in one way only. And the other thing I do want to acknowledge, and I acknowledge that in the book as well, is that there are things that the data does not capture, partly because the right questions are not being asked. So, for example, a lot of the data in my book, in that chapter in the book, is around intercaste and interreligious marriage. And the young man who I spoke to, one of the people I spoke to in the book towards the end of that chapter, when I asked him about what he felt, because he himself was in an intercaste relationship, and I told him how rare intercaste marriage in India is, and does that make you feel unusual? And he came back at me with his point, which was that, well, you've not looked at data on intercaste relationships, on love. He says you're asking, or your data is only looking at marriage. So it's entirely possible that data misses some of these nuances. The question of, for example, what do people eat as vegetarians or non-vegetarians in their house versus what they eat when they're outside. If the question purely asks you, do you cook meat at home, it might miss the nuances of people who don't eat meat at home but eat meat outside. Similarly, if the question is only around intercaste marriage, it might miss people who have had intercaste and interreligious marriages, but it might not have ended up, relationships, but it might not have ended up in marriage. So there is you have to be humble about what the data can capture and not sort of assume that it's got a perfect view of the country. Just as reporting or anecdotes or narratives are missing a lot, I am fully on board with the idea that the data misses a lot too, particularly on difficult and sort of hard to answer questions around things like relationships, around intimate relationships, around things that are physically dangerous, like what you eat or who you're in relationships with. I'm entirely prepared to believe that the data misses a lot.
Right. And perhaps, I will ask maybe one or two more questions, maybe one, I don't know if they'll allow me to ask one more. But the question is really about, data in post-truth, in the age of post-truth politics, which is that we live in in an age of populist leaders and post-truth politics who thrive on, emotional appeals and claims masquerading on dubious facts. And so, my question is, what are the most interesting facets of the relationship between populism and data, other than, the obvious issue of data manipulation or suppression? Can data rescue us from post-truth politics? And here I want to sort of tag on your how you end your book in a very hopeful note. You really do believe that data can bring us together, in the sense that we are a society a world even deeply divided ideologically on the left and the right, and we can't stand, each other. And you say that data can at least bring us on the same page. And so I'm wondering if this is too naive, or what are the limits and possibilities for this,
That's a great question and something that keeps me up at night. Um, so I am not I'm not a true believer in that. I don't feel that data alone is going to solve all debates and bring the left and right together. When I write something like a news article that debunks something popularly held. So, for example, some months ago, I put out a story that was showing the beginnings of a vaccine effect, which is that vaccines were having an impact on lowered hospitalizations and deaths. What you would expect was exactly what was happening. When I write something like that, people typically write into me saying, "Thank you, I'm going to share this on my family WhatsApp group," or it's going to help me in the argument I'm having on Facebook. I am not yet convinced that data in particular has some particular advantage over other sorts of attempts of persuasion and argument, because just the way that other arguments and journalism sort of sometimes runs up against its own echo chamber, I see that happening with data journalism as well. And particularly because we now see quote unquote data being used by all sides, you feel like there's always someone with a viewpoint that you agree with who can come up with some data that you can then sort of cotton on to. So data alone, I don't see it as being something that'll cut through. What I do have some hope in is a combination of data and an attitude of being fair. And I don't mean objective, because I don't think objectivity is it seems like a fool's pursuit, because it interferes with the act of being human in some ways. But I think fairness is a noble pursuit and something to try and attempt. I do think that doing this, both the attitude of it and the technicalities of it, can push beliefs, or sort of push attitudes or thinking a little further than an echo chamber. And what I mean with this is, the attitude of it is to not cherry pick data, is to try and be fair to what the data says. And the technicalities of it is to try and make more and more data open. So when I report on a large data set, it becomes incumbent on me to link to that data set, or if it is not publicly available, to put it up in a public sharing repository like GitHub. And this is a practice that's followed by data journalists across the world, and I think really needs to become a common practice here, because in a way it does help cut through the crisis of credibility. You are saying, here are the raw numbers. If you don't believe me, here is what I found from it, but feel free to go to the numbers yourself and see if I have done justice to these numbers. That's more the sort of journalistic project. When it comes to politicians too, or sort of populist arguments too, I do see this happening, which is that there seems to be alternative numbers and alternative facts for everyone to turn to, but it's easier to fact check and easier to sort of push back against. And I've had a couple of recent instances in which I've sort of tried to think about what are all the factors that have come together to allow something to move beyond an echo chamber. And I felt this in the reporting of excess mortality by me and other journalists over the last 6 months, which is that what I and other journalists found was that deaths, particularly during the second wave of the pandemic in India, were far in excess of what the official count was showing at the time. And I feel like, the uptake of this, all of us have seen that this similar reporting was done even in media organizations that aren't typically anti-establishment. It was done in a lot of non-English newsrooms as well. And when that is done, it is because the news organizations are seeing that there is some resonance in popular opinion. So if I think of the factors that come together to allow data to cut through breach an echo chamber, it has to in some ways validate what people are seeing in their real lives, and it has to in some way provide dignity or a voice to people who are being left out, and left out not on a particular side of the spectrum, irrespective of that. And the reason I really think that this reporting got so much resonance is because of the sheer fact that everyone, all of us, practically every Indian knows someone who died in India's second wave. And the act of it not getting dignity in numbers was something that most people felt was abhorrent, and it went beyond what they felt about who they're going to vote for. Now, these same people might vote for the same people, and that doesn't even matter necessarily. But the fact that that this reporting was able to give some dignity to people who were searching for it, I think helped them. And we did also try to follow all the best practices of making the data public and putting it out. It's still accessible on GitHub for anyone who wants to look at. So I wouldn't say that it's cut through to the government. I don't think the government is ever going to accept or doesn't accept yet that that the COVID numbers are an undercount, but it did cut through beyond the usual sort of publics who take up, it did cut through echo chambers in that respect.
Right. Well, I think, there have been so many things to think about, in your answers, questions that I still have, but I think I will, proceed to invite the organizers to maybe ask the audience if they have questions. And if I do have time to jump in sometimes, in the middle of that, I would like to maybe ask a question about, something that I've been dying to ask, but, didn't get a chance to. So thank you, Rukmini. Let's take, I think let's let the organizers take it on from here.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Rukmini. This is a very, very encouraging this is very engaging conversation and a great learning experience. And we have a lot of questions in the chat box, so I would like to call one of them. First up is Professor Jimol Unni. She is a professor in the Economics and Public Policy area in Ahmedabad University. So Jimol, if you could please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, good afternoon, Momita and Mona, and very wonderful to see you here online, Rukmini. I mean, that was a fascinating talk, and of course, I'm sure the book is fascinating. Now I must scan. I hope there's a Kindle version that I can get hold of. I'm sure there is. So I'm let's say, a data freak, so to say. So I have a question with regard to the consumer expenditure thing that you said. I'm on one of those committees which you were referring to as, what is it you were calling it? What is it? I don't know what you were calling it, but the committees which look at these data sources before they're released and so on. So there is a view which is actually coming out of the government. This is in relation to the question that the thing that you were talking about, the consumer expenditure data not having been released and so on. There is a view which is coming out of the government and very clearly out of the NITI Aayog that there's really no need to collect this household level consumer expenditure data because there is all that big data out there, and because of the kind of digital footprint that we are all putting in. And in fact, the view is so strong that they really think that there's no need for any of these. After some time, you might see the NSSO dismantled. Difficult to do that. But the view that, we can figure out every kind of consumer behavior, and this extends to other things. I'm just restricting myself to consumer behavior because of the fact that there is this digital footprint and you can, get it out of the big data. So why collect this data? What is your, understanding of that or your view on it?
Thank you. Fantastic question. And it also reminds me that Mona had raised a point about the differences between household data and administrative data, which I didn't tackle then, but I'd love to talk about it now. And yes, I agree that this is a view that I'm increasingly seeing from government, and it has echoes in different forms. So when it comes to consumer expenditure data, it is that, it comes from other consumer behavior. When it is employment data, it is that we can look at the EPFO and look at payroll data. Is data on access to sanitation, it is that we can look at how many toilets were built under the Swachh Bharat mission data. So this sort of focus on administrative data and consumer behavior data rather than on household level data is something that I'm seeing a lot. And I mean, you would know this better than me, but in the areas that we have been able to make comparisons, it immediately becomes apparent why household level data is so essential. We see this, for example, in the data on sanitation. According to the Swachh Bharat mission administrative data, India was open defecation free years ago already. But we know this from the NSSO's household survey data that this is not the case on the ground. We know similarly from EPFO data that from employment data that in a period of high unemployment and high youth unemployment, payroll data was not an accurate indicator of what was going on in terms of employment. And of course, this would not come as a surprise to any labor economist anywhere, because no sort of respectable country looks at payroll data to try and understand what's going on in and unemployment. I think it's really important to talk about this, because then it becomes easier to begin debates and conversations when this narrative is pushed further, as it absolutely is happening. I think the most respected economists across India and the world have repeatedly made the point that household data is essential. They've been having this debate around around national income versus household survey consumption expenditure data since for 30 years or more now. So this sort of familiarity that people, especially the more right-wing school of economics, would prefer many of these other sources rather than household data, which does come with flaws, is something that we need to talk more about, so that we can have a conversation and have a better pushback against it. But on the only additional point I would like to make is that to strengthen this argument and strengthen the pushback against it, which I do think a pushback needs to happen, those like me or others who are believers in household data do need to take on board and acknowledge the flaws in household data as well. Because if we don't do that, then that is left to critics, who can then say all of this data needs to be jumped. So if we start acknowledging that household consumption expenditure surveys are probably missing some amount of consumption at the highest end, then it becomes easier to sort of defend it against wholesale sort of critics. So I do think that strengthening the pushback, strengthening household surveys and improving them is perhaps the best argument for them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jimal. Next, I will request Shivani Mehta to unmute herself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, Momita, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Mona ma'am. Hi, Rukmini ma'am. And just to give a brief introduction about myself, that I am a PhD student under Dr. Aditeshwar Seth from IIT Delhi. And my first question and my research area focuses on monitoring the development, mining activities, and forest and agriculture covers in India through satellites. So my first question to Rukmini ma'am is that how far the data journalism have come and will go in terms of policy making and policy changes at the level of government.
Thank you. And also, as someone who looks at satellite data, I'm sure you'll be interested in the recent economic survey, which does a bit of looking at satellite data, as well as the sort of criticisms of the use of that data by those who work more with satellite data and point to the problems with how some of the data was presented in the economic survey. As I said, I don't want to overstate the importance or the role or the ability of data journalism to change minds, whether broadly among the general public or whether in government. But let me say that in the last couple of years, I do think there have been improvements in the government's data sharing mechanism in making file formats more accessible. And there are many in government who are committed to open data and to making data more easy to access. So when data journalists, who are typically the ones who push for more accessible data to be made available, there is some uptake from government. I think what's happened in the past is that the government or all other sort of establishments have been used to insights from the data coming from them. They see the census data and they tell you what it is. They'll give you the press release, they'll give you the handout. So this change of data journalists with the ability to look at numbers and say for themselves what they're seeing in the numbers, say what they see are the insights, which might be at odds sometimes with what the government is putting out, is a sort of uncomfortable thing, a sort of tension that's still being figured out. This happens less now, but I used to frequently have this problem that if I was trying to get a response from a government official after looking at something I found in the data, they would say, but we didn't say this in the press release. They're not used to the idea of independent analysis happening. I would imagine that this is something that's changed, particularly in the last 2 years. There is so much visibility for data journalism during the pandemic, whether from international journalists or in India as well. So as that happens, hopefully the government will be more receptive to insights from the data coming from journalists. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I do feel that there are many in government who care about making more data available and who value the insights that come from journalism. Of course, on the other side, there is the issue that I have, for example, with the National Health Mission's data, which is that every time I write about it, it goes offline. So that happens too.
Thanks, Rukmini. I got your point. And my second question was, as you said, that there are different definitions of urbanization in different contexts. So what other metrics do you see other than average development index and Gini coefficient that are relevant for the urbanization?
Okay. So I suppose there is a question about whether the definitions that the government is using are too broad, narrow, and whether they need to change over time. So some argue that the official Indian definition of what it means to be a census town is to move from a village to a census town is too narrow and too stringent, and this sort of artificially lowers India's urbanization rate. There is a counter argument that this is a definition that has echoes in the definitions used by other developing countries as well. So I don't find myself on one side or the other of that argument. I don't actually think that the problem, we have a problem in across the board in official data of capturing things that are on a spectrum, right? We can capture one end or the other, but things that are on a spectrum are hard to capture. So I think we're seeing that with urbanization as well, which is that if something is not clearly a village or clearly a town, but in that in-between space, then I think definitions struggle over there. Perhaps it needs some, creative thinking around what could be at least informal definitions of urbanization, but I'm not equipped to come up with those.
Thanks, Rukmini. Thanks.
Thank you, Shivani. Next, I would request Professor Kaushik Jana to come on camera and ask his questions.
Yes, thank you, Momita. Yeah. Hi, Rukmini. My name is Kaushik Jana. I teach statistics and data here at Ahmedabad University. And like your book is kind of a inspiring work for me. And I also follow your book. I started to follow your book while I teaching student here. And I have one question which is related to the book. So in the book, you look at specific question related to society most of the time. and then you provide descriptive statistics data. Then you choose 1 or 2 cases, nicely illustrate those cases, which kind of give the background stories of these descriptive statistics. Now, my question is how you choose, what tools you use to choose those cases, those interesting cases. Now, I know theoretically this is very difficult kind of issue, but in practice, how you do that? That's what I want your insight. And other suggestion I would say is that like we are teaching a course here at Ahmedabad University with my colleague Marian Chakko, who is an educational anthropologist. So we are bringing the data, the qualitative and quantitative research methodology together, where we are collecting data, again bringing the descriptive statistics, and then we have the opportunity to, since they are students, they have time, and they can study 3 or 4 case studies for illustrating 1 or 2, like kind of illustrating the descriptive statistics. So they can choose more than 1 cases. Now, what would be your suggestion? How they should choose those cases? It's close to the median of the population, close to the one median, one towards the tail. What would be your suggestion? Yeah, thank you.
Such a great question, and reminds me of how much easier it is to be a journalist or a writer than an academic, because I am not constrained by needing my case studies to be representative of anything. Essentially, they are stories that come along that help fill in some of the gaps in our understanding, add color, give a sort of human face to what you're talking about. And I sympathize with your need, because I think that's much harder to do, to find case studies that academically work for the work that you're presenting. Just to give an example, some of the case studies that I look at, or stories that I look at in the book, actually undermine the point that the data is making, and that's okay too, because I'm not essentially I don't need to prove a hypothesis. In fact, my point is that reality is messy. Here's what the data says. Here are stories that actually show you that the data misses things. The example that I gave, for example, of the young man who said that data wasn't capturing intercaste relationships. After I've written a whole chapter about intercaste marriage, I'm presenting a study that, in a sense, invalidates the data that I looked at. But I have that luxury because I don't. Because this isn't an academic work. It's possible that it would make more sense to look at median case studies for what you're talking about. But I would just add, especially if it's not a purely academic publication, that, or even if you're looking at the median in the case study, what makes a story particularly engaging, in my view, is when some part of a person's life doesn't fit purely within the like narrow space that you've given them for that case study, right? Because all human lives are like that. There is a part of their life, like someone's average spending on salt is someone's monthly spending on salt is the precise Indian median, and so you want to use them as a case study. However, if there is something interesting going on in their lives, if now a doctor has told them to cut down their salt consumption, and they're going to have to think about how they're going to cook without salt for the next few months. I just say that adding these things that don't fit purely within the case study that you're using, just as a line or two, makes it much more interesting. Because sometimes, both in journalism and in the academia, we really flatten people so that they can fit precisely what we're talking about, and that takes out the creativity, and that takes out the humanity from their lives, because then they just become textbook examples, and we've taken out all the other interesting things. So I'd just say that whatever unusual parts remain in their life, even if it's beyond the scope of the case study, include them just because of what they add to narrative. That's what I would suggest.
Yes, very interesting. Yes, thank you, Rukmini.
Thank you, Kaushik. That was indeed a very intriguing and interesting question. Next, I would ask Professor Bhargav to unmute himself and ask his question.
Hi, yeah, good evening. And thanks a lot to the organizers and the speakers for this wonderful discussion. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question, meaning as a teacher who is teaching data science and analytics, is there a particular software or that you would recommend that the students learn in case they want to build careers in data journalism? I mean, I know Excel, but sometimes you have to do work on the fly, something that from the industry that would be very useful for us as a teacher to know.
Thank you. So this is the part where I should come clean. I mean, I come clean about that early on in the book as well, which is that I don't have a training in maths, in economics, or in statistics. And so my work is constrained by my technical abilities or lack thereof, which is why I use Excel and not much more than that. This isn't to say that this is what I would advise people. The more skills students can gain, the better for them. And I think what's increasingly happening with data journalism teams who are able to do truly ambitious work is that they typically include a developer in their team. So being able to scrape data from government websites is almost now an essential skill. Just to give you an example, when we first started doing the excess mortality work, the easiest place to go was the Chennai Municipal Corporation's website because they upload every single death certificate back to the 60s. However, they don't give daily counts. So all I needed a developer to do was to be able to scrape the death certificates on one page, which was for one date, and tell me what the daily count of it is. So if your students are able to gain even basic programming skills to be able to do data scraping, I think they'll find it invaluable when it comes to government websites. Similarly, being able to turn files into machine readable formats is something that they'll be spending a lot of their time on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a very useful answer. Thank you so much.
Actually, if I may just come in on that, I just want to say that, in some ways, I think, Rukmini, your work is so valuable to people at Ahmedabad University, who are being trained in interdisciplinary forms of education. So not at all to undermine technical knowledge, but really, I think the value of your book and your work is how do you ask the right questions? How do you sort of nuance, the reality, and how do you sort of complicate, what numbers show you? And I think that goes beyond, technical expertise alone, although not at all, not to belittle that. But I think those are the tools one must start with, and the other stuff, I think, does come and one can, develop it over time or borrow it. But that's my 2 cents on that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we have a lot of interesting questions that are coming up also. So I would really request, Rukmini, if you could give us like 10-15 minutes more so that we could take those questions. Okay, so we next have Professor Pallavi Vyas. So Pallavi, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. This is just fascinating. And Rukmini, this is amazing that your training is not in economics, math, statistics, and you have such a good handle on data. Kudos to you. And I think Mona asked, the last question was really important in terms of context. Mine is a more banal question on like how, when, I've been trying to get government data and I filed an RTI and it, they basically didn't give me any data at all on like vital statistics data, which we know that every government body has. But they were, because I was asking for girls and boys and they were obviously worried that, somehow they would be shown in a bad light. And that seems now like, it seems to be a repeated pattern because I asked for like, basic statistics like, diagnostic centers or health dispensaries or whatever. And there's such a reluctance to give the data. So like, how do you create like contacts with certain government organizations so that, they're, or how do you build those relationships?
Yes. So when it comes to the RTI, I would say that going in for an appeal is something that you should consider if you know that the data is maintained by that organization. But yes, especially as a journalist, a large part of my job is building these contacts, simply because sometimes you don't know where to go for the data, or you know that it's available with government, but it isn't being shared with you. So just as, and this is another way in which data journalism fits into the wider journalism landscape, which is that building sources and contacts is such an important tool for all journalists. It's similarly essential for data journalists, particularly in settings like India, where access to data is such a big problem. And then one thing that you end up having to do is also becoming a bit creative about sources. For example, again, I keep coming back to the excess mortality story, but it's really been one of the defining data journalism moments of the last few years. And because we knew that there was an undercount going on and we did not have ways to access more accurate data, looking at civil registration system data for deaths then became an unusual way to go about it. And this is something that we figured out looking at the data journalism that the journalists in other parts of the world were doing. They were, of course, accessing official data that was being made available to them. We were having to think of how to develop sources to get that data. Yes, I mean, really beyond building sources and being really dogged. And sometimes I think, building sources at lower levels of government, even with journalists who are tasked with covering small individual departments, is often more useful than going right for the top. Yes, and then being very dogged about it.
Thanks. Maybe we need to build relationships with journalists as researchers. Maybe they'll be able to point us in the right direction.
I actually think that's been a very sort of fruitful relationship over the last couple of years, relationship between journalists who sometimes have access to the data but don't really know how to contextualize it or go about it, and academics who then help them figure out what they could tell from it and then later work on it to do their own academic work. That's been a fruitful interaction, and through the pandemic, especially when there was such a steep learning curve for most journalists.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. So next we have Jacob Jute. Could you please ask your question?
Hello, ma'am. It's a very interesting talk so far. My name is Jacob. I'm an MBA student from Ahmedabad University. So I have a quick question regarding the COVID data. So we have many news written in the past about the, not reporting the actual number of COVID cases. So who do you think is responsible for all of these manipulation in the data?
So that's a good question, because when it comes to COVID data, I think there's COVID deaths data, there's multiple reasons why this undercounting is happening, and many of those are not, they're not sort of active acts of suppression. So first of all, we came into the pandemic with a system that did not register 100% of deaths. We registered only 9 out of 10 deaths across the country, and in states like Bihar, we register only 50% of all deaths even now. Then medical certification is a further problem. We certify only 1 or 2 out of every 5 deaths. So most deaths in India happen without any official paperwork around what the cause of death was. That was something we came into the pandemic with. Then during the pandemic, administrative systems were absolutely overwhelmed because of the sheer number of cases they were dealing with. Additionally, governments decided to use a very narrow definition of what a COVID death was, which is that you had to have a positive test prior to death. And we know that in the second wave, for example, when everything from testing system to hospitals became overwhelmed, people were dying without a test, let alone being admitted in hospitals. We know this was happening. So that very narrow definition also led to the numbers being artificially lowered. And then I think finally the problem is a refusal to acknowledge the fact that some deaths will be missed. So let's think of alternative ways to estimate how many deaths were missed. Because this is something countries from the US to the UK to Australia with well-functioning registration systems have accepted that they are not going to be able to capture all deaths. In the US or UK, for example, the problem is in elderly populations in nursing homes or who live by themselves, who are missed sometimes in the data. But this is where the problem comes in. These are sort of systemic issues which are harder to resolve. But when you start refusing to accept that there could be a problem and look at ways to come up with alternative numbers, that's when you end up with where we are right now, which is 500,000 officially certified COVID deaths and an estimated 4 to 6.5 million likely real deaths from COVID. So systemic issues plus then a sort of political refusal to engage with any criticism of the data.
Thank you, Jacob. Now I would request Gopal to, I mean, you had your hand raised for a while, so could you please ask your question now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. And this is very relevant and very essential for especially the PhD students, today's topic. Because I'm a PhD student with the Center of Environment and Energy in Ahmedabad University. And my problem, the problem that I'm facing is doing a survey. So I cannot do a very large survey if I need to see Jharkhand, Bihar, or 3-4 states, and I want the demographic data of the states at the district level. I cannot do such a large survey because I don't have resources and other constraints, and those data is not available. So how do I have a sense of what is the demographic of these states at the district level if I want to do a certain study? My and required and this kind of data.
So there are, granular and disaggregated data is a big problem in India, particularly at the level. And then imagine the plight of people trying to do this work at the parliamentary constituency level, because, even though a lot of data, some data is available at the district level, the boundaries are not the same as parliamentary constituencies, and that becomes a further problem. So I don't know the specifics of the data that you're looking for, but if that's not available at the district level, and I would say that that's relatively unusual because, census, NFHS, all of this data is available at the district level. However, there are now some groups that do put out in the public in publicly accessible repositories district level data that's not otherwise easily available. So I would point you to groups like Development Data Lab that put out a large amount of district level data, as well as what is it called? The Geographic Insights Lab, I think, at Harvard, which similarly headed by Professor Subbu, he's called Subramanian. These two groups have been systematically putting out a lot of data at the district level in publicly accessible repositories. So if this data has been collected but isn't easily accessible, you'll find it there. If it hasn't been collected at all by the government at the district level, then you're in trouble.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gopal. And as you mentioned very correctly, that today's conversation is very interesting for all our students. So next, we again have a question from a student, one of our MA Economics students. So Ayush Kumar. So Ayush, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thanks. Hi, ma'am. So actually, my question is from a philosophical angle. I mean, we have been reiterating that this world is a complex place. We are not a quantitative being, but a qualitative being also, because so many of our, say, dependent variable, if I take terms from radiation analysis and so on, maybe decided by so many factors that we can't actually compute, like as we talked about intimate relationship or our identity, but on identity work has been done, but for example, intimate relationship. And there is reluctance in giving such kind of data. There might be some ethical issues also. So my question is that, is this only a problem of developing nations, or developed nations also face such problems in terms of collecting these data? And if this is only a problem in developing nation, then what should we be doing to get away from this problem and get those data? Because I believe for a developed nation, it is important that we have such kind of data so that we actually understand that, okay, people are doing what they want to do. They are happy with their lives. They are getting the meanings of their life and so on. So how should we proceed about that?
That's a great question, and that's something that people working in surveying and opinion polling do spend a lot of time thinking about. You know, whether there are ways to ask these questions in a better way to elicit responses, whether there are other countries who do it in a better way. And I would say that there is, you know, we shouldn't discount the training and the abilities of people who are doing it right now. So, for example, the National Family Health Survey asks about intimate partner violence, and you know the immediate response I often see is, you know, who's going to tell a government surveyor? But I think that discounts the fact that these are trained surveyors, and these are surveys that have been carried out for 30-40 years with some amount of training and pedigree, you know, to be able to ask these questions. The question about whether developed countries do it better brings up an important, you know, a further question really, which is, I think one of the things that developed countries actually see is this question of the social acceptability bias in answering questions. And this is something that I look at in the book, for example, when I talk about intercaste marriage, because there's a researcher, an economist named Payal Hathi, for example, who has compared questions on intercaste marriage or intergroup marriage asked in India and in the US. And, you know, she makes the point that in the US, for example, admitting to being opposed to interracial relationships is now socially unacceptable. You know, that's not an answer people give in surveys anymore. And she makes the point that this doesn't mean that racism has ended in the US. We know that that's not a fact, but it has reached the point that that's become an unacceptable answer to given surveys. So it raises the question that are those surveys then accurately capturing people's motivations? Or is it also important that the surveys are capturing the fact that people feel it's no longer okay to say that in a survey? That too means something. And the fact that we in India remain in a place where people think that it's okay to tell surveyors that you practice untouchability, or that you are opposed to anybody, not just you or your children, anybody having an intercaste or interreligious marriage also says something. So the fact that surveys miss these points is not you know, and it's not a problem that ends discussion in a way. One of the ways to get past it is, of course, triangulation through better sources. And I find it, when it comes to intercaste marriage, for example, I try to look at a triangulation between what people are saying that they feel about intercaste marriage versus the proportion of actual intercaste marriage in India. So we see this sort of disconnect between the answers that young people give. For example, over time, a larger proportion of young people say that they are not opposed to intercaste marriage. However, the proportion of people actually having an intercaste marriage hasn't increased at all. So there is that difference between what you say and what you actually do. And I think one sort of source that other people are increasingly using is data from big tech companies. So what do people say versus what they are searching for on Google, for example, or what do people say versus whose profiles they look at on a dating or matrimonial site, for example. So this does raise ethical questions, but these sort of you know, attempts at triangulation of data then become important.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions. I would just like to invite Mona to share her concluding comments.
Well, I just want to say, Rukmini, that I enjoyed the conversation greatly. There were issues that I wanted to cover that you kind of alluded to it in the very last question about, you know, the big problem of the problem of data and whether too much data can be a bad thing also. I mean, the question of data and secrecy, data and the weaponization of data by big corporations and, you know, authoritarian regimes. So those are perhaps, very interesting, complex questions that we didn't or weren't able to talk about. But I look forward to reading your work in the future, definitely looking, out for your next book. And thank you so much for, this very insightful, conversation. And I hope that we can have you physically sometime in Ahmedabad next. Thanks you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I was so pleased to hear the questions from your students as well. And it really goes to show that, you have a very engaged student community. So very happy to answer questions from your students as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rukmini. We were really very happy to have you here, and thank you for this very engaging conversation. And thank you everyone for joining. We'll stop here and we'll see you again in the next session of the conversation series.